Today I'm going to start a new series. This series is going to be on seams, S-E-A-M-S, like in sewing, in the Gospel of John. This is all new content. I did not discuss supposed seams in my book on the Gospel of John, The Eye of the Beholder. So as a subscriber to this channel, or even just someone who's dropping in and looking at this content, this is brand new. So I hope you'll find it interesting. What are seams in the Gospel of John, and why are they of interest to us if we're interested in whether the Gospel is historically reliable? Well, the word gets used really broadly, as I think you'll see in this series. I'm not going to do several of them today. I'll probably just mention one as an illustration. Something that it gets called a seam by Johannine scholars is any kind of alleged contradiction or even an abruptness in a transition that the scholar thinks indicates an editor. Okay, so the reason that the word seams is used is because it's being allegedly stitched together at that point. And you know how when you have a really, really good seamstress, a person who sews, and she puts two things together on a sewing machine, she does it really well, you don't even notice, it's nice and smooth. So the idea of seams in John is that the seams are showing, that the editor didn't do a really smooth job, and that's why we can notice it. And that's why that term is used. So it can cover anything from, it could just be a somewhat abrupt movement from one scene to another, which happens a lot in achronological narration. We'll see that when we get to discussing the supposed seam at the beginning and end of John 5, to things that Ehrman calls internal contradictions within the Gospel of John. Sometimes these are called aporias, A-P-O-R-I-A-S. Now that's actually quite a strong word because it means an internal inconsistency or tension that you just can't get past, supposedly. Okay, so why should we care about this? In and of itself, the fact that some transition from one scene to another is a little bit abrupt really has very little to do with accuracy or reliability. I could be telling you a series of completely, totally true stories, and one might not seem to have much to do with the previous one. I just start right into the next story. So by itself, that kind of so-called seam really doesn't call reliability into question at all. And by the same token, I would say there's no reason to take it to indicate the hand of an editor or the involvement of anyone other than the beloved disciple himself. A lot of times you get people jumping from one thing to another in oral memoir where they're just telling what they remember. So, but because these are taken to indicate the involvement of an editor, they then do start putting distance between the eyewitness, the beloved disciple himself, and the text that we actually have. So that you could have, sometimes it'll be claimed, multiple editorial layers. You get an editor and then an editor on top of an editor, another editor, and so forth, by people who were not eyewitnesses. Okay, and so who may have even done things somewhat incorrectly. And that's kind of the point of some of these that Ehrman calls contradictions. So I'm going to give one example from Ehrman right now that will illustrate the kind of thing I'm talking about. In John 4:54, Jesus has just healed the son of a royal official. He's healed him at a distance. And it says, this is the second sign that Jesus did. And then it's a phrase like, having come out of Judea into Galilee. Different translators translate it different ways. After coming out of Judea into Galilee, when he had come from Judea into Galilee, etc. Okay, but that last phrase is a qualifier on that statement that it was the second sign. Now, what Bart Ehrman will do here is that he will say, well, over at in chapter 2, it said that Jesus did many signs in Jerusalem. And back earlier in chapter 2, the miracle at Cana, which is in Galilee, is said to be the first sign. Okay? So Ehrman will quote, this is the second sign that Jesus did, and then he'll stop and he won't quote the part that says, having come out of Judea into Galilee. And he'll say, how could this be only the second sign? Yeah, first sign, many signs. Second sign, what's that? Because if Jesus had done many signs in Jerusalem, well, then how could this only be the second sign? There you go. There's a claim of contradiction. So the idea is that this is the sign of an editorial hand. This is a seam showing where things aren't really in the correct order, and yet the wording, this is the second sign, supposedly gives the impression that these are being told in a particular order, but that order has to be wrong because it can't be the second sign because he did many signs in Jerusalem. Well, this one's extremely easy to harmonize. There's no seam there, there's no contradiction there, no aporia there, and it's really a case of very misleading quotation by Ehrman, because that qualifying phrase says it all right? The author is counting it. It's the second one that Jesus did, having gone from Judea to Galilee. Before the time when he turned water into wine, he had gone from Judea to Galilee. Okay, so because he had been down in Judea where John had baptized him and so forth, and then he gathered some of his earliest disciples, and they went to Galilee, okay? And he turns the water into wine. Then he goes to Jerusalem in chapter 2, and it says he did many signs. It doesn't actually, as I recall, narrate any of them, but just that he did many signs in Jerusalem. Okay, Jerusalem's in Judea. Then he comes from Judea into Galilee again and heals the son of the royal official. It's the second sign that he did after he came, on an occasion after he came from Judea into Galilee. Super simple solution. This is hardly a desperate harmonization. In fact, it only appears to be a contradiction when you leave out part of the verse. So that one's easy. But that's an example of an alleged seam that supposedly betrays the hand of an editor who wasn't doing a very good job. You will see some resemblance here to editorial fatigue. It isn't supposed to be the same phenomenon, but you'll see some comparison to that if you have watched my series on supposed editorial fatigue. Now, something I like to do, I wish it weren't necessary, but since it is, I think it's a good thing to do, is to point out when it's not just Bart Ehrman saying something, but when a evangelical-labeled scholar has also said the same thing. And that is true here. It's not someone I talk about a lot. I quote him one time in The Eye of the Beholder. Gary M. Burge. He has a book called Interpreting the Fourth Gospel. So he is, at least in some people's eyes, an evangelical scholar, evangelical-labeled scholar, and he certainly writes in that way. When you read this book, Interpreting the Fourth Gospel, he's sort of trying to address his book to an evangelical readership and sort of educate them, supposedly, and open up their minds. Now, Burge is all in on this idea of editorial seams in the Gospel of John. And I want to read a couple of quotes from Burge, all right? He says, "The recognition of aporias suggests that the process of writing, compiling, and editing the fourth gospel was more complex than we ever realized. Brown," that would be Raymond Brown, for example, supports 5 separate stages of editing by a community, with various hands making their contribution at various times. All of this began, in my judgment, with John, the beloved disciple. Well, that's really comforting. All of these many stages of redaction began with the beloved disciple. Whoop-de-doo. I mean, what we're doing then is we're putting multiple people in between the beloved disciple and the text that we actually have. Now, that has implications for the probability that the text is accurate, because these various people were not eyewitnesses, probably not all of them if they existed at all, which I don't grant, but these various editors, what we're doing is we're getting all this distance, right, between the eyewitness and the text as we actually have it. And you don't recover that reliability just by, putting your hand on your heart and saying, well, all of this began with the beloved disciple. But Burge really pushes. And here's another quote. So we have a puzzle. The fourth gospel is a fractured text. Seismic seams, literary lacuna, and editorial traces are abundantly evident. The phenomenon cannot be lightly dismissed, and interpreters must be aware of it as they move through the text. Well, yeah, actually, the phenomenon can be lightly dismissed. I'm going to do a series here and dismiss it. And I'll be, at times, citing D.A. Carson. I'm aware of these claims because I do read the commentaries. This isn't something that everybody has always known. I haven't seen Richard Bauckham address the issue of seams, but I do know that Bauckham is very down on the idea that the beloved disciple just stood somewhere way back behind, stood behind, but how far behind the Gospel of John. If he wrote it, he was close enough to dictate it. Okay, so that's not something that it's likely that Bauckham's going to be on board with either, of this idea of, multiple literary layers and so forth. But you can really see that Burge is saying, how dare you, basically, question this. He brings in consensus. Near consensus seems at hand, he says, that a community did collaborate in the development and preservation of the Johannine traditions. Well, so much for near consensus. We want to find out if the evidence actually supports this. And oddly, Burge even tries to sort of sell this to a conservative audience in a very strange way. I don't have a verbatim quote of this, but it's from the same book. He says that this may be considered an advantage by a conservative scholar or a conservative audience because it means that the Gospel of John is based on sources instead of just being sort of invented by someone at the end of the 1st century. Well, why are those our options? Okay? If our only alternative to believing that somebody just made up the stories out of whole cloth, somebody who had no connection at all to the events just made it all up, or that it's based on earlier sources, even written sources, well, then I guess the second of those would be somewhat less bad than the first. But those are not our only options. After all, the conservative position traditionally has been that this was written by an actual member of Jesus' inner circle, the beloved disciple. Maybe he dictated it to somebody, but that he was the author in a very real, very hands-on sense of the document that we possess. Okay? Obviously, we possess it in translation, so yeah. But the point is, that's the alternative. And especially if you're writing to a conservative lay audience, as Burge is, that's what they've been thinking. They've been thinking it was written by a disciple of Jesus named John. So it's kind of a trick to say, well, you guys should think this is an advantage, because after all, this means you use sources, and using sources is better than not having any sources. Well, he wouldn't need a bunch of other sources that would then have to be stitched together if he was there himself. So you're trying to get people to say, oh yeah, well, I guess this is pretty good for our position, without sort of admitting that you're getting them to abandon what was previously the default position, which would actually be much better for the reliability of the gospel than some series of editors stitching together sources and sometimes doing a ham-handed job of it. That's not an advantage relative to the traditional view of authorship, which is not just that the beloved disciples stood somewhere back here and then there were layers of redaction after that before we get to what we have. Now, of course, to say something really isn't an improvement from a conservative perspective isn't to say that it's wrong. We have to look at the arguments. And so that's what I'm going to be doing in this series moving forward. I will be addressing all of the ones that impress Burge, which inter alia cover the ones that impress Ehrman as well. So I hope you'll come back. I hope you'll find that interesting. I like to keep the content on here fresh when I can think of something fresh to say. So please come back next time for this series on alleged seams in the Gospel of John. Come back to the Lydia McGirt channel where we're making common sense rigorous.